Hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to our episode of Scrum Pulse. My name is Ravi Verma. I will be your moderator today, and we are really happy to have you join us, whether it's live or whether you might be hearing this on a recorded session. So let's start by recapping what Scrum Pulse is all about. This is a free monthly webinar facilitated by Scrum.org. It's community driven, so we pick topics based on what you folks recommend via user voice, scrum.org/scrumpulse, and these webinars are also recorded and they're available for you to listen to at your convenience. There is one unifying thread that runs across all our Scrum Pulse sessions, and that guides us in terms of the vision of the series. We would like to restore the focus of empiricism in Agile conversations. We want to have topics that help our industry deliver value to the business continuously, and we want to improve and increase the trust between business and IT. So these are our core objectives for this series. Before we get started, I'd like to talk a little bit about the housekeeping and the guidelines. So your microphones are going to be muted throughout. However, we would love to hear from you. A couple of ways you can share your questions and comments. You can tweet your questions. Make sure to mention our handle at scrum.org and use the hashtag ScrumPulse. So we will be monitoring that feed, and then as those questions come in, you can, we will monitor and we will add them. And you can also type your questions or comments into the webinar chat window. So we will be monitoring those as well. And we will do a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and then we'll get as many questions as we can. So with that, I want to introduce our speaker today, Dave Dame. Really honored that David is our speaker today. He's an enterprise agile coach from PTC. He's got 18 plus years in software development, 10 plus years in agile training and coaching, and he's a senior director of agile and lean practices at PTC. We're honored to have him as our speaker today. He's going to talk about real world techniques from the trenches that he has used to scale agile in a large organization. So with that, I would like to hand over to Dave. Dave, please tell us a little bit about yourself, and then let's dive in.
Hi everyone. So most of my experience has been in enterprise agile. I haven't had the luxury too often of doing a small to medium. The majority of my experience has been working with large organizations. So I've worked with about 3 or 4 large-scale adoptions through my career, and there was no one approach that worked for every organization. So I used imperialism to really be able to shape and mold what particularly an organization needed to do it. So I'm going to share with you some of the good practices that were common or consistent. But a good thing to remember as we're going through this, your organization will be different. Hear these best practices to build your toolkit, and do a series of inspection and adaptation to continually learn and give your organization what they need.
So Dave, you may want to, next time if it pops up, you can choose keep the current scheme or something so it won't bother you again.
Okay, thank you. So like I said earlier, I've had a number of agile transformations, but the important thing to remember is it's context specific. No two organizations are exactly the same. There's no two that are entirely different, but there's no two that's entirely the same. So context matters. So you really need to really work with your organization, work with your teams, and be able to kind of inspect and adapt the things you need to do for a proper enterprise adoption. Just don't throw a cookie cutter fast approach in there. And you got to remember, it's journey, not a destination. You don't get to go to Agile overnight. You make the decision to go Agile but that's the start of the journey in Scrum. You have to continually evolve it as you go through, and you really need to build a culture of continual learning, because you can plan for the next little while what you'll do, but what you encounter, what you face, is going to require you to change directions or re-update your plan for the transformation. So do regular cadences of inspect and adapt and steer toward your journey of agility. And a big thing to remember is you have to manage anxiety. Every enterprise or organization has a change threshold. So you really need to manage the anxiety of your organization, and that's a fine balance. There's no algorithm I can give you to measure it to a data point. You really have to get a good sense of how do you keep them uncomfortable just so they keep moving and inspecting and adapting without making it where it exceeds the anxiety. So you're going to find yourself trying to manage the anxiety level of your organization as you introduce change. Because how every individual interprets change differently, so too does the organization. So at PTC, we do regular release cadences. So we break everything up in a release to deliver software. So at the highest level, we have a release, and that's tied to a particular product. And then we have where we do continual elaboration all the way through. So what we found is to avoid the start and stop between releases, through a series of inspections and adaptations, we've learned that we have to do continual elaboration all the way through to keep the work flowing. And so we can remove from doing big batch type of efforts to plan and get things ready for teams to digest, so they have a continual flow of work. And just to give you a bit of background for our specific implementation, we deal with regulatory compliance as well. So we're a large organization, we're geographically dispersed, and we have to deal with regulatory compliance. So what I'm showing you is what we've learned over a series of years, the best way to articulate how we're doing the releases. So that way it speaks to the governance regulations that we're going through, as well as helps us keep agility. So we're really trying to balance agility with discipline. So we run, in particular, we run a release where we try to coordinate all the teams in a standard cadence where we have them all aligned to do their sprints all together, because it makes it easier to integrate into the builds. So that way at the end of every sprint, we have everything integrated and we have a reality point of where we are at that time. So this Agile SDLC we show really shows we have a release, and every iteration contains a number of synchronized sprints between all the teams so we can sync it up. So we've kind of came over this because it gave us the visibility, the transparency, and from dealing with the regulatory compliance, we're able to show we're mitigating risk by having smaller iteration containing all the sprints. So at the end of every sprint cadence, we know exactly where we are. Like what we learned with keeping continual elaboration, we also found out that we do continually release theme planning, where through regular backlog refinement meetings, we're constantly refining the themes and stories throughout the iterations and throughout the release. So that way it gives the teams the soak time it needs to break these things down and to digest it, but also to think of the edge cases and things that come out of when you're trying to refine requirements so it's easily digestible. And by doing it continual, they're able to reach out to those pockets of the organization that we still have specialization in, whether it's architecture, UX, or any of those specialized resources. By doing regular, consistent backlog refinement and doing that requirement refinement all the way down, we're always able to make sure that we're keeping our backlogs updated so we can keep the flow of teams and momentum going and to keep that heartbeat running. Some of the early measures we use to measure how we're doing along, and the important thing with a metric is it should serve a specific purpose. And you have to be really careful how you promote these metrics, because unfortunately, if you over-promote them or put too much emphasis, it might affect the behavior you're getting from the teams in the organization. So some of the metrics we use to help us get a good visibility and to see how things are going. Because unfortunately, when you're a large enterprise, you can't be in front of everybody all the time. So we really looked at metrics which really showed reducing of spillover work to make sure that we're making sure we're not having too much spillover, that we're getting stories complete to the definition of done by the end of sprint. Now what we found is when we overemphasize this metric, we're getting the behaviors that were kind of causing some teams to undercommit. So we've learned that a little bit of spillover should be anticipated and expected. That way the teams feel that they can really stretch themselves. So we don't get them the behavior of thinking that spillover is an entirely bad thing. We just want to make sure we're minimizing it. Another metric and measure we found was limiting the work in progress. So we're trying to see how many stories were active at any time to get those behaviors of teams that used to not be a cross-functional team to now they are, to work together to get stories done. And trying to emphasize the value of it's better to get more stories done than to have a bunch of stories in progress. So we would measure that. And then we would also measure to see how soon our early defects were being posted to make sure we weren't falling in the mini waterfall scenario. So what we wanted to do was seeing testing early and often. And that requires quite a bit of behavior changes on how the team works together to get those things. By measuring those three things, and now we measure a bunch of other things as we're further along our journey, we're able to see how we're doing across the organization, whether we're getting the behaviors of, of Scrum and Agile ingrained in our teams. So here's some practices that, that we found that really helped us scale in our Agile journey. So like I said earlier, we deal with regulatory compliance. The really big challenge with regulatory compliance and Agile, they can coexist, but they have slightly different, they come at it from different points of view. In Scrum and Agile, we value trust to teams. Regulatory compliance, they'll trust you, but they want to see the data, and they want to make sure the right person made those decisions. So in order to really make both sides of the camp happy, to be able to give the kind of governance that the regulatory compliance needed, but really to give the teams the kind of autonomy that they need to be truly Scrum and Agile, we started creating risk tables where when we assess release themes and stories, and you'll see how our requirements break up a little further down the presentation, that the teams could assess what the risk level was on a theme and story. By having teams really get the chance to assess the risk during regular backlog refinement, it showed that for things that the teams identified or the subject matters identified as high risk, then we would put more rigor into things. So we would have more detailed design documents, approaches, reviews, and approvals because it was high risk. And then for those themes and stories that were low risk, we would really have lightweight design where it was like screen grabs of whiteboards, and there was really less outside reviews and approvals needed. By showing that we're explicitly making that decision on release themes, it really helps solve that. In regulatory compliance, they want one approach usually that's consistent all the way throughout. This really helped us begin to change the way of thinking, that one size doesn't fit all. So this way, by showing that we have the teams give the autonomies to adjust the rigor they need, it really keeps the balance and it allows the teams to have control to decide which things need those risk mitigating factors. You heard me discuss elaboration and how we really break down requirements to different levels. Because we're a large organization, we need some connectivity and some traceability all the way back up to the highest level requirements. So we go either a business theme or improvement theme, which are really high roadmap items that span across releases. And we decompose those into a series of release themes, which is a subset of the business themes or improvement themes. And then it really, when it gets to this level, the release theme will fit in one release. And you can have many release themes in a release. So that way, as you put release themes to the corresponding business theme in a release, you're able to trace how far you're going to solve that business theme. Because sometimes a business theme will span across multiple releases. By seeing how the release themes break out in multiple releases, you have a good way to forecast how you're doing to realize that business theme. And then so as the Scrum teams work on these refining of these release themes and stories, they break it down to product backlog items to fill their backlogs, and the stories relate up to a release theme. So this way we have traceability from the roadmap to the actual Scrum teams that are doing the work, so we can have the right level of requirement for what's needed in a section, but have complete transparency into seeing how we're doing realizing those things. And because we do all these things continually, it prevents the start and stop in between releases. And we found over time, it took away those big marathon sessions of getting things ready for a release. There's still improvement that we're trying to get better at this thing, but after a number of years, we've kind of learned from trying to take in some lean practices of keeping continual flow. And by keeping continual elaboration and refinement, it really reduces the big batches. So that way we're continually working, they're manageable chunks, and we're building momentum. And then there's smoother transitions between releases. The biggest benefit of continual elaboration and refinement, it provides soak time. Individuals, intellectual workers, teams need that soak time to digest things, to be able to think of the different possibilities and edge cases and the impacts to many things. And then it really gives the opportunity to interface with the subject matter experts outside the development team that might be across your enterprise and organization. Because it's not a big batch and a one-time event that's continual, you can always schedule somebody at the next week or whatever the next cadence of those regular meetings are to get that subject matter expertise injected into the team to make sure everything is being refined and getting built into what eventually ends up to be great product. One of the biggest transformations, and across many different organizations I've worked at, where they've stayed component teams, where they went to feature teams, or if there's been a hybrid of both. Sometimes it might make sense to keep a component team for a certain area because of the sensitivity to the core of all products. But and just to kind of baseline everybody's thoughts on component teams or understanding of it, they're really organized across technology layers or application components. So for example, a client team, a server team, really tied to a layer of technology. And really, we scaled this early on when we used to do traditional software methodologies like waterfall, because it really lined up to manufacturing where we specialized certain elements of the development process, thinking that we get efficiencies by specialization. And then work is assigned on specialty rather than customer value. Because when you're lined up in components and they're specialists, you can't always pick from the top of the backlog on the way down, because you really have to line it with that component team's affinity or specialization. And then they may be only responsible for part of the feature, which causes you challenges when you're trying to deliver customer value because you inject that dependency of trying to coordinate backlog items between teams. And that's where the dependency gets in to complete the work. So then you're unable to complete the work in one sprint or iteration, that it takes a number because of that injected dependency. So then some of the drawbacks to component teams is it encourages doing easier work rather than the most valuable. And I don't mean to say it's simplistic or easy. All technology is very complicated. But they'll choose things in their area regardless of value because they have that they're unable to work on higher value items. And then it really kind of keeps sequential life cycle development instilled in your development methodology because you're stuck in trying to coordinate between different teams, which causes delay. And then because of the coordination between teams, there's more planning and coordination, and it really limits learning. Component teams are really good in their individuals where they're all experts in that area, but it really limits the learning to that one technology layer versus the whole product and the multiple layers. There's more code duplication because it builds up. And then we've really noticed because they're the people maintaining the code, sometimes they get used to their own culture and nomenclature and how they deal with code because there's no outside people reviewing it from those component teams, that it doesn't tend to keep clean and neat as when feature teams and you have wider view of the code. So this is why we value feature teams. They're usually long-lived Scrum teams, and the reason why we like to keep them long-lived is that way they can go through the Tucker model and really stay at a high optimum level of performing because they continually work together, they continually learn from one another, and they really learn to work well as a unit to be able to deliver complex work. They're cross-functional, so we have development, test, design. And they're really cross-component. So they're really working on vertical slices to deliver a piece of value. So they have that opportunity to do that. And they're comprised of generalizing specialists. And they're really responsible for the end-to-end customer features. And we like to work on features in priority order. And we mindfully assigned based on past experience, because we still want to try to get as much productivity as we can. They're largely independent and self-sufficient. And some of the things that I've observed to a few organizations, it increases the value throughput. It really increases the learning, which is the key benefit of it. They're not only learning about the element of the product they're working on, they're actually learning broader skills because they're a cross-functional team and product knowledge. So continually, even though we say, generalizing specialists, to be able to learn new skills of coding, testing, specialties, the whole team gets to be more balanced through that continual learning. It simplifies planning because we don't have to coordinate amongst many teams or different technology layers. There's less multitasking because they're not helping out other teams because of the specialization of the team. It really reduces the waste or handoff to coordinate between teams, which results into less waiting and faster cycle time. And it really makes change easier, and we've seen the teams be more motivated because they feel empowered and they feel that they have the empowerment to deliver a piece of value. And now scaling feature teams are hard too because when you have large organizations, you can't have one humongous backlog. So what we do is try to define it in different requirement areas. In our particular context, application lifecycle management, product lifecycle management, and service lifecycle management. By kind of creating these requirement areas, it allows the backlogs to be prioritized appropriately or ordered appropriately, and it's able to allow us to scale and easier coordination across a wider organization. So we've heard the challenges with specialization, that there's the silos of knowledge. And because there's the silos of knowledge, you really have a lot of knowledge kept in very few individuals of the organization. So if they leave the organization, it really puts it at a high risk because all that intellectual capability is leaving out the door. And it really poses a challenge for load balancing because they're dependent on a specific silo of knowledge. There's a challenge to scale them wide. So a generalizing specialist is someone with one or more technical specialties who actively seeks to really broaden their skill set and then learn new capabilities in other areas. And when we say generalizing specialists, what we're not trying to say it is at the individual level, that we would like teams themselves to be well balanced, meaning you could have some specialists in the teams that specialize, but that collective team as a whole have wider skills to balance all these things. So you'll have different expertises in certain individuals, but because we want them to be continually learning from one another, over time they broaden their skill sets in other secondary and third areas. So that way they can, as a full unit, become generalizing specialists, even though there's going to be people with certain affinities and specialties that they enjoy. But by putting them together, they get to learn and really understand each of the different functions and wider skill sets. And it really allows them to really develop. Now, subject matter experts, like every large organization, we have traditional teams of architecture, UX, and a bunch of different specializations. So what we tried to do, because unfortunately we can't get a senior architect for every Scrum team, we try to work on these architects to become subject matter experts. So even though feature teams, everybody's working on the code, they almost become a guardian and understand the area of the code or the area of the architectural element. And they really provide that stewardship and coordination, and they're really working with the teams to share on their learning or actively doing. When you first move to a feature team and utilizing subject matter experts to work with the teams on basis, and how you coordinate it is through that regular refinement. For those release themes that have high risk or stories that require an architect or subject matter expert, we may assign them to the team for a short time or get them more heavily involved. And initially, the architect still might be doing a lot of the doing, but over time we want to move them from less of the doing to more of the knowledge sharing and collaborating. So that way teams understand that area more for next time, but that way it's able to scale more. So the architect will still work with many teams, not just the one or two, but still inject that subject matter expertise into the different work areas. Another thing we try to really employ in a large organization is the concept of communities of practice. So there could be different communities of practice for Agile maturity, software development, UX, because we know the teams are really good to learn from themselves at the end of each sprint because they do regular retrospectives. But how do you share that learning across many teams? And that's why we build these community of practices, so each function can share what other teams are doing. So it really broadens the opportunity for learning across multiple teams and multiple areas of the company. So they usually establish their own charter, and they really help bring in and come up with consistent guidelines and best practices for all the teams to share. So that way not everybody is reinventing the wheel, and they take ownership of building those good practices. that they're going to do. And regular meetings in the COP really allows for that ground level innovation of what teams are facing and getting the real world where things are, meeting regularly to make sure the guidelines meet what they need for today's world. So these community of practices have been really critical for us to scale, to share across a large organization. Because if these community of practices aren't set, some might be long-lived, some might be short. But without this mechanism, the opportunity to share between teams sometimes gets overlooked. So by having these, it really encourages that cross-team collaboration. And for further reading on things that I talked about, John Cotter, who's amazing about, making change work in any conditions, I highly recommend reading any of his books. Agile retrospectives, because that drives every Agile adoption. You're never 100% ready. You can't forecast or predict the future. Do it iteratively. Use imperialism to get that through. And for more about future teams and how to scale, look at Scaling Lean and Agile Development. So in summary, remember, when you're scaling agility, it's a journey, not a destination. You can't predict the future. You can't try to see everything that's going to come up no matter what your experience is. Start on your journey. Create a good structure of community practices and communication mechanisms, and regularly evolve into your agility. You need to balance agility and discipline. Like all of us know on the call that people take Scrum and Agile and they interpret it to what best serves them. Try to keep the proper balance. And remember to think of agility factors, whether you have technical debt, whether you have, everybody has technical debt, but geographically dispersed teams, which is a challenge, but what's more of a challenge is different time zones. So factor all those in. And really introduce practices iteratively. Like I said earlier, you want to balance the anxiety. So really, and only people can learn and absorb so much, so do it iteratively, but do it continually. And then always inspect and adapt. Yesterday's solution was only good for as yesterday. Always change, and there might be things that you've implemented that you know now could be improved or tweaked. Don't be afraid to change yesterday's solution. Fight complacency, and if you don't do it in a Scrum-like way, you do get complacent. So continually inspect and adapt and fight complacency, because usually that's the biggest thing that stalls any Agile transformation. And so now I think, do I turn it over to Ravi?
Yes, please, Dave. So if you don't mind, could scroll to the next slide. So Dave, thank you so much for that very pragmatic and empirical set of ideas for scaling. The questions are starting to come through, and I would like to just remind folks about the different ways in which you can share your questions and comments. You can either tweet them, make sure you mention our handle at Scrum.org and the hashtag ScrumPulse, or you can type your questions or comments in the chat window. So with that, I want to first go to the first question that's come in. So one of the questions that's come in, Dave, is related to the topic of the spillover metric and guarding against the unintended consequences of metrics. So one of the audience members had a question. You mentioned how the spillover metric caused teams to under forecast. Wasn't that a welcome change from the opposite? Did they then recognize that there is a sweet spot?
And that's a very good point. Like any metric, right, you swing the pendulum from before there was crazy spillover work, right? And let's be honest, the spillover was a horizontal divide. The teams were developing and then testing the next sprint. So by doing the spillover, we tried to get the balance, but unfortunately, because we overemphasized it, the pendulum swung the other way where they undercommitted. But you're right, the teams and the Scrum Masters working with those teams went, okay guys, we're picking up new stories 2/3 of the way throughout. Can we get a little more courage to try to really stretch ourselves to take on more? And it is an ongoing sweet spot. And it's funny that you don't really ever solve this problem, but you're trying to balance that pendulum of overcommitting and undercommitting. But that's part of inspect and adapt, and that's the very fundamental reason we have those retrospectives.
Very good. Thanks, Dave. A lot of questions coming. The next question is related to the topic of feature team versus component team. So one of the questions is, have you encountered any drawbacks in migrating to feature teams? And I think one clarifying follow-up comment that came in, while transitioning from component teams dispersed over more continents to feature teams, people and knowledge have always got to be reallocated. Are there some techniques that work well for you? Did you encounter this, or do you have advice on how people might handle this challenge?
So can you read me the first part of that question again, so that way I can do that, and then I'll tackle the second part?
Sure. The question was, are there any possible drawbacks to feature teams?
Yes, and I've seen the drawback when we've had a legacy suite of products that shared a common spine between them. And it's because it was a legacy suite, because it was built on proprietary technology. It wasn't easy to get that knowledge shared easily or rapidly to be able to have different people working in that area. So that made sense that we had to keep them component teams, but we had like I would say a 5-year plan to build that repository of knowledge, so that way it'd be easier to teach the other feature teams, because we had a hybrid, right? We had them as a component team with other feature teams, and what we wanted to was broaden the knowledge and dependency over a 5-year plan. So that would mean building a lot of good repositories, lunch and learns, community of practices to get that learning, because unfortunately that one component team, we were bottlenecked because they could only serve so many feature teams at once. But over the 5 years, the dependency became less and less. But that was a good example of we couldn't move that to a feature team without causing a major disruption to the business. And what was the second part of that, Ravi?
Yeah, I think the second part was, let's say I have a distributed organization, and location 1 specializes in component 1, location 2 in component 2, and so on. And now I'm trying to break up these component silos and trying to create feature teams. So how might I handle the transfer of knowledge from these silos to feature teams? So I think that was the question.
And that's a great question. So what I've done in the past is component teams, there's always certain component teams that are dependent on one another, and they're kind of work regularly together to coordinate between them. I would section off areas of components of related areas of the product to move them to feature teams first. By breaking the teams up and creating new teams, let's say you have 3 component teams across 3 continents that are very dependent on each other. Instead of doing the whole organization, focus on that small pocket. Create 3 feature teams by the members of each teams being part of other teams. So you inject that knowledge into every one of the new feature teams. And then that way, they're still closely coupled, but they're more loosely coupled. And it gives them an injection of learning to build from each other, because they're getting those people that used to be in a component team into these new feature teams. And like we said with feature teams, it really accelerates the learning, because you have the specialists ingrained within the teams, and then they're broadening it, but they're still loosely coupled where they can relate to the other experts in the close-by feature teams. And again, and it's a good point this person brought up, it doesn't happen overnight. So you look for ways like that by seeding the teams with those specialists to accelerate their learning. Because it's not till that learning is ingrained that you get that you really get to see the the maximum returns on investments that future teams can give you.
Very cool. Very cool. Thanks, Dave. So, Dave, one more question. When you began, you were mentioning that you have to have awareness of your context and situational scaling, perhaps, or be empirical. Now, in the market, there are other frameworks, and some of them might be a bit more prescriptive, or perhaps even they may be more like processes. Where somebody says, "Hey, here's the blueprint. Now just go and implement this in your scaling and everything's going to be fine." Do you have any thoughts on the kind of pros and cons of those kind of prescriptive scaling techniques?
Well, the pros of putting a pre-described model of everything specific, I'm sure that model worked for a specific situation and problem, and it was great. And all these models are valuable, right? SAFe, DAT, and a bunch of others. And just like Scrum, but the fun thing about Scrum is that's the purest point of being able to inspect and adapt. You got to find your own model, right? There's no model that fits perfectly. And what I've found when we tried to inject a more detailed model in, or just kind of force it in, it wasn't really solving the right problems, or the more urgent problems at the moment. It caused us spending more time on lower value problems instead of focusing on what our real problems are specific to our organization. So by doing an empirical process, it really allowed you to target on what specific does your organization need. Now, over many years, it might resemble some of these other models, but the order in which you do it, the way in which you do it, the way you balance the anxiety and the threshold of learning is going to differ because you're going to get immediate results to steer. By doing a big bang approach like that, it takes too long to really adapt any feedback loops on how to alter that, because every model needs altering. So why invest up front? Just like, why would you plan software up 3 years in advance? Because you don't know what the market's going to want or the customers want. So why would you pre-prescribe your Agile model in advance? Because you're not going to know what your organization needs. So start lean, start small, and inspect and adapt and build the right model for your organization.
Perfect. Got it. Couple of more questions, Dave. So one was, let's say, I really love that graph that you created, which kind of created transparency on the distribution of skills on a given Scrum team. So let's say I have a Scrum team where I identify that there are one or more areas where our Scrum team has a deficiency, and it's preventing us from being truly cross-functional. So we kind of feel that, hey, we need to create more expertise in a particular area. Now, any thoughts or any ideas that you have found useful in having the development team members themselves volunteer to say, hey, I'm going to go and learn more about this area because I know it's hurting our teams, as opposed to one of the audience members has experienced situations where the Scrum Master almost has to take a command and control approach and kind of mandate that they have to tell a specific or team member or multiple team members to say, guys, you have to go and learn more in this area. So what techniques have you found to kind of foster that self-organization and people being inspired and motivated to learn and become experts in an area of deficiency?
And I've learned that from the painful way. Right early on in my career, if I found a team that was struggling with UX, I chose the person that I knew I could always count and deliver, go, you must learn this and bring this to the team, which yielded me some results, but because that person had no interest in UX, it was a short-lived benefit. So what I really tried to use is use the retrospective and say, hey, we always suffer when it comes to the UX part, we drag behind or we're dependent on other teams. Is there anybody here that has a passion for UX or interest? And usually there's somebody with an interest, which is a start. But that's why you want to use those community of practices, because Those will help load balance and share the learning between teams. So those are the person you want to get involved in the UX community of practice or whatever the specialty is to build the skill and really help foster and show the value of when it comes in and measure it, right? Because in this example I'm giving, if UX is always the challenge or struggle to finish stories, if we see that it's getting better, and it's okay for that one individual to get UX skills, but hopefully they take that knowledge and share with the rest of the team some things that they can do. So that's why you really want to unify that community of practice, because there could be another team in the organization or a center of excellence that's very deep, rich in UX. But you got to give them that platform to be able to learn and be the conduit between that Scrum team and the expertise of UX to build those skills.
Very cool. Okay. Possibly one of the last questions. So one question was a specific scenario that one of our audience members encountered where they were trying to scale in a large enterprise. The challenge was that the business and IT, they were separated. I think what I'm reading is separate business and IT in the same city. So that turned out to be kind of hindrance to collaboration or communication, and the specific question is any tips to convince them to merge? Maybe if I take this question a little bit to a higher level, any tips to help break through organizational silos and barriers that may prevent effective scaling?
Yeah, and I've seen that quite a bit, whether it's IT or business or like business units and R&D. What you really need to do is go at a high enough level to get common goals. Because what I've seen when these barriers exist, each group has different mandate and different objectives. What you need to do is get them together and get shared mandates and objectives, where it's not really, we're not trying to get virtualization all across the board. If we try to combine it with business and go, we need the ability to rapidly have environments up so we can deploy and build quicker to get System X to market. That should be the objective. It should be tied to really business or customer thing, and the IT and R&D is what supports it. But you need the two sides to come together in common. They have to be steered toward the same common objectives, because if not, they're competing objectives that may not necessarily roll up to the most optimum solution. But like when you want to create feature teams that are cross-functional, you really want to create a cross-functional organization. We can't have different silos in the organization. We need to break them up into agility teams or cross-functional groups of the organization to really be able to collaborate and get those common goals to deliver.
Very cool. Thank you, Dave. This is one of the most interactive sessions we've had, and we've had real-world questions coming in from the audience, and I'm sure that you guys got some valuable ideas, practical ideas that you can take back to work. So with that, I think I'd like to start wrapping up this session. Before I wrap up, I want to tell you a little bit about Scrum.org. We are a mission-driven company, and the reason we wake up in the morning, there is one goal that guides all of us. We want to improve the profession of software development, and we do this in a variety of ways. We have our training series, we have assessments, and we have coaches and consultants who are all unified and inspired by this common goal. And we have our community, that is all of you, and so we cannot accomplish this goal on our own. So we request all like-minded people to come and join us. Go to our website, Scrum.org, learn about what we are doing, get involved, participate in our discussion groups, and share your thoughts. And let us know what topics you want to learn about in these sessions going forward. So check out Scrum Pulse, view our earlier recordings, spread the word with your friends and colleagues, and vote for items or propose new items for our future sessions. So with that, I want to thank David Dame for one of the best and most interactive sessions on scaling Scrum. I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day to join us. look forward to seeing you in another one of our sessions in the future. So with that, thank you, and have a nice day or evening depending on where you are.